Yeah. Cool. It's time? Okay, we better just do this. Hey everybody, thanks for coming to my talk. Yeah, name and lights, that's a first. That's really cool. I'm gonna use that for everything. Can you see my first slide? SVG is for everybody. We have 30 minutes, we're gonna talk a ton about SVG and you're gonna be super pumped about using SVG when we're done with this. Cool. This is that's an SVG file I have on my computer. It's called horse.svg. I love it. It's one of my favorite SVGs. The two primary reasons that people are super stoked about SVG. One of them is that if I take horse.svg and I display it on different monitors, different screens of different sizes and different pixel densities and all that stuff, horse.svg is going to look great, super sharp, super beautiful on any screen of any size and pixel density. It's going to be great. And it's just one file. It's just horse.svg. That horse.svg happens to be 13.9K. And there isn't just like the medium version of it is 13.9K, but if I need a really big version of it, that's going to be bigger. No, it's the same 13.9K everywhere. So that's just kind of, I think that's why people are primarily excited about SVG right now, is because it's really sharp, it looks really good, that appeals to designers, and for the most part, this can be abused and there's exceptions, but it's smaller in file size. SVG was kind of born during a time where there was lots of modems and stuff, and bandwidth was at a premium, and it was like, if we just sent over the instructions to draw something, that would be way more bandwidth efficient than it would be to send over the pixel-by-pixel data of things. And it's kind of what's the same reason that we're excited now. We're still concerned about performance and bandwidth stuff. Yeah. But now it's because we have like super huge displays with deep pixel resolution and stuff, and sending over giant JPEG assets is a problem now. We're like, maybe if we sent over the instructions on how to draw something, that would be better. Anyway, those are the two things that I think people are the most excited about. That's why SVG is a hot topic right now, but we're just going to keep tossing stuff on the pile of SVG awesomeness. If you use inline SVG, the SVGs are stylable. You can apply CSS to them and style even the individual little parts in SVG, which is pretty cool. The parts can be in the DOM, so you can do your JavaScripting on the things if you need to. It can be really systemic. We're going to get into using SVG to build an icon system that, like, the syntax of SVG is really ready to be used as a system. There's all kinds of amazing animation possibilities, interaction possibilities, and they get the nod from the accessibility community, which is always awesome. But maybe the third big reason that SVG is such a big topic right now is, here's the obligatory "can I use" slide, which is that gray bar across the middle is the current version of all browsers right now. It's green across the board. SVG's got the thumbs up from everybody, and not only that, but the version above that, the one version back in browsers, green all the way across. Version above that, green all the way across. SVG is like, the time is now, it is here. And so it took a while, but SVG, kind of good to go. So we'll talk about fallback support, because the IE 8 and Android 2.3 are some fail points there, and I'm surely some of you support those things still. And even if that's the case, it doesn't mean no for SVG. So if you open up horse.svg and look at it in the browser, you might be like, hey, that looks a lot like HTML. It has angle brackets and attributes and stuff. Yeah, that's because it's XML, essentially. What's kind of cool about, you might look at that, though, and be like, what do I look like, Chris? Some kind of math nerd? I can't do that stuff. You don't really need to, of course. Some program just generates that for you, generally. But what's kind of cool about it is that it can be learned. That's a thing that you could learn if you wanted to. I don't muck about in the syntax of shapes and stuff all that often, but I kind of get it, and I can, and it's nice to have that knowledge. You can't really learn the raster formats, right? You can't learn JPEG. It's not a thing that you can do, You can't look at that and be like, it's a tree. That's not going to happen. It does, but it largely looks like this. There's rectangles and circles and stuff, and it kind of is nice to be familiar with that, even if you don't use it that much, because generally something like Inkscape or Adobe Illustrator is generating it for you. I think most of us have a pretty good intuition as to what kind of things are vector and what kind of things are raster. SVG isn't trying to replace raster graphics. That's not in its agenda or whatever. This is a photograph of Bob Marley. It is always going to be a raster graphic. It needs to just be that way for us. So, yeah, like the joke. It's coming. Raster. Anyway, that's the last joke. But this This version of Bob Marley would be very good at being vector, and I think we just intuitively understand that. It looks like a vector thing. If you're using it on the web, it probably should be SVG then. Our intuition is mostly right, usually, in these cases, but there is kind of a spectrum, and I stole this from a guy named Todd Parker, but I think he describes it pretty well. There's like the watermelon slice, clearly vector. On the web, should be SVG. But then like there's the Firefox logo there. There's just a lot of intricacy and the little country stuff going on there, and the gradients happening in the tail and stuff. It is a good vector graphic, but like the PNG version of it might actually, even a fairly big one, might actually be smaller than the SVG just because it's fairly complex. I should actually test that one and get some data and stuff, but you know what I mean. Sometimes vector stuff is complicated enough that it still makes sense to use the raster one, so it's kind of usually it's a test and decide kind of scenario, and sometimes our intuition is just wrong. Like this looks pretty JPEG-y, or it did to me at first. It doesn't look like the flat stuff you normally associate with vector design, but it's actually a pretty small SVG file because it's pretty simple shapes with pretty simple gradients applied to it and stuff. And then this, we have like, see those trees at the bottom there? Clearly vector. Clear at least started life as vector. Like shouldn't that make sense to be vector on the web? No, it's just a little too complicated. Like those trees actually as a PNG are pretty small file size, and whatever, it just worked out better to use raster in that case. So how do you get your hands on some SVG? You could just learn to use an Illustrator, a program like Adobe Illustrator. Here's me just basically rocking at Illustrator. Basically an incredible designer, so. Anyway, you get it. I'm gonna convert some stuff to outlines, and then I'm going to save as from Illustrator. And SVG is a native file format of Illustrator. It's not something that you like export to. It's just Illustrator just can live and breathe SVG files as a native file format, and though that file format works great on the web. So there might be a little extra cruft in there occasionally that you could clean out or optimize or whatever, but for the most part it does a good job of making SVGs for the web. Hot little tip about Illustrator, if you have Creative Cloud version of it or newer, because there's like some new version of it now. If you hit copy, what goes on your clipboard is inline SVG. So here I'm just going to paste, copy from Illustrator and it pastes out inline SVG. So just kind of a good thing to know, kind of cool. Hashtag hot tip. Anything vector can be SVG. So if you like use stock photography sites or whatever, you can often trim the search results by vector, and who knows what kind of weird formats it comes in. It might come in as an EPS file or a PDF file or whatever. That's okay. Just download it, open it up in Illustrator, make the changes you need to do to it, and save out. And as you can save as SVG from Illustrator. This is the dialogue you're presented with there. Just make sure it's SVG 1.1. Turn off preserve Illustrator editing capabilities, which puts a lot of junk in there that you don't need, and then you'll get a pretty good SVG for the web. What do you do with that once you have it? You can use SVG in your HTML documents as easy as that. I didn't know that for a long time. I just didn't, or whatever. I was like, maybe but you can't do that with Canvas, right? So like, why could you do it with SVG? Aren't they? Anyway, you can. So if that's the one thing you didn't know about SVG that you learned today, I consider that a rousing success. You can use it in CSS as well with the background image property there. It's just shorthanded, but yeah, you can use SVG that way as well. It happens to be a pretty good way to get gradients in IE9, because IE9 doesn't support the CSS3 gradient syntax, but it does support SVGs. So another hot tip. Cool. And then here's just an example of that. HTML5 hub website has this cool paper rip effect there. That just is a background repeating SVG element. So if we dig in and find that graphic, there it is. It happens to be designed such that the left and right rip line up with each other, and it gets that effect, which is nice. This is an example of using SVG with the border image property in CSS, which is, it's a complicated one to understand, but it's kind of based on 9-slice scaling. So you have an SVG file in the corners of it kind of are placed in the corners, and then the middles of it repeat, and it happens to be kind of a perfect thing to use for SVG because of the scaling factor of SVG. Just know that. It kind of changes your mindset a little bit the more you use SVG. Because you can resize it, and because you don't lose any quality when you do resize it, which we're used to in raster world, never make anything bigger, because if you do, it loses quality. you don't have to worry about with SVG. You can make it bigger if you want. So we dealt with that with raster images with stuff like this, right? If it's an image, we want it to be never any wider than its container. Let's say you have a container, it's 500 pixels wide, but you have an image in it that's 600 pixels. You'd be like, no, don't do that. Don't bust out of the container. We want you to shrink max width 100%. But notice we're using max width, not width, because if that image in that 500 pixel container was 400 pixels, say, you wouldn't want to stretch it any wider. We're always very nervous about that with raster graphics. You could do this. You'd be like, well, unless that image is SVG, then don't use max width, just use width. I'm not saying go ahead and throw that in all your style sheets, because that would probably do weird stuff, but just know that you don't have to worry about stretching SVG, because it just works fine. It's weird to look at yourself. Hi, self. Same thing you might worry about with background size cover, because it's kind of a cool thing in CSS3 where you take this image and be like, just do whatever you need to do to make sure that you cover all of the area of this element, including size up. That's nerve-wracking in JPEG land, because it might get too big and then get all gross looking as raster, but in SVG land you don't care because it's going to scale just fine. That's the kind of idea there. This isn't theoretical stuff. I use SVGs and I just drop them in blog posts all the time. Here's me I made some dumb little blog post about box sizing and dropped this SVG image in there, and it kind of reminded me, I'm like, that's kind of cool, because like if I ever needed to change that graphic, that is the source graphic. So I can just go to the blog post, download it again, edit it, and upload it. I can't lose files anymore. There's not like a PSD in a Dropbox that I'm going to lose somewhere. Kind of nice. And there's me just reading that same post through syndication, renders fine. You know, just saying it's ready to be used. We're going to spend most of the rest of the time, though, talking about inline SVG because it's really cool. You can take the syntax of SVG and just put it right into HTML and it will render. So this is what I mean by that. Here's an image tag linking to some SVG, and then below that, it's a little video. Right? Did it play? Come on, buddy. And then below that is the syntax for the SVG, that file. I'm going to grab all the contents of that file and replace it. Replace the image tag with the guts of that file instead of the image tag, and look what happens below. Nothing. That's the same thing. You can use inline SVG right in your HTML, and that works. There's 3 big advantages to doing it that way. One is that all that stuff then becomes in the DOM, and you can then style it with CSS and do JavaScript stuff to it and all that. There's no additional HTTP request being made for that information to draw it. There's nothing wrong with linking up images with the image tag, but if you're looking into ways to make your website faster, the less resources a website has to request, the faster it is generally. And so it eliminates a request, which is kind of cool. And it kind of gives birth to this system, which is going to be cool, which we're going to call SVG templating. Let's get into this. I think this is pretty interesting stuff. Forever, we have been trying to figure out ways to take lots of graphics and serve them to a website really efficiently, right? One of those ways was CSS sprites. I'm sure some of you have done this or are still doing it or whatever. It's taking a kind of a raster graphic and putting lots of different images in it, and then with some CSS stuff, you set a particular size, and then you shift the background to only reveal the little part of it that you wanted to see. It was a way to make websites faster. We have lots of graphics we want to display. Let's pack them all into one, only have to make one request for that, and then just do our little ninja stuff on the CSS side to only show the ones we want. We're trying to solve a speed problem here, essentially. And that's exactly what we're going to do with SVG as well. That's the same problem that icon fonts are solving too, right? It's all these little graphics smashed into one file so that you only have to request one, but have a system for using those fonts. Turns out sites often have a need for icons. Here's github.com. I noticed they're using some icons here and there. There's actually a couple more too. They need icons. They have a need for icons on their site. They need a system to use it. So here's how we could approach this system in SVG. Opening, close, opening SVG tag, closing SVG tag below that. The text gets a little cut off here. I think you've seen that. No big deal. Let's say we have 2 different icons that we're putting in our system. One of them is the Twitter bird little logo thing, and one of them is like the CodePen logo, which has the little box and then a circle around it. So one of them has 1 path, and one of them has 2 paths. We take those elements that draw those paths and we put them in the SVG tag. However many paths they have doesn't matter. Then around those, we'll put a G tag. G is just a generic, it's like a div in SVG. It has no real meaning. It's just a group so that we can apply styling to it or just kind of semantically group things together. And each of those group tags will have an ID that we can reference. Then we're going to wrap all of that in a defs tag. Defs in SVG just means I'm just defining this in which to use later. Don't render it like you normally would. And we're going to take all that and we're just going to put it in our document somewhere. We'll just put it at the top of our body element, and then we're going to say display none. That's what defs already does, but the SVG element will still take up a weird amount of space. So just make sure that it just gets displayed done, because we're just defining this stuff in which to use it later in our document. We might even like abstract that out into another file or something. And then anywhere else in our document where we want to draw that shape, we use this use tag and with this funky attribute xlink href, and then use the ID that we gave those G tags that group those things up. And that's all you need to do. That will draw that shape anywhere else in the document that you need to draw it. So a real world implementation is here. Let's say I have some navigation with some links that link to some places, and there's SVG put into each of them. You might be like, oh, I see what he's doing here. This is like a bunch of buttons, and there's an icon next to the button. It could be that, but in this case, it's actually the navigation on CSS tricks. I drew that tab shape once as vector, defined it, and then just said use across those tabs, and just applied a little bit of different CSS where I changed the fill color, and that's how that works. It's a fairly efficient thing to draw, very little code to do that. And works over and over and over again. I use it in the footer as well, where there's repeated shapes like that. It's not repeated code, it just uses that same defined block twice, so pretty cool. This is a website for the CSS conf that I thought was pretty neat, with these Lego bricks animation that falls. You might think, wow, that must be a ton of code. It's actually a very small amount of code. They defined, I think they defined 2 Lego bricks, the double width size and the single width size, and then just used them all over the place and applied different fills to them in simple animations. That's kind of a clever little technique, you know? Let's make this a little bit better by getting that big chunk of place where we're defining all those icons and get them out of the HTML block. It's just not very efficient if you do a lot of HTML caching and stuff. It's better to have that be an external resource that we can cache. So we could take all that file or all that stuff that we've already done and drop them into just an external file. We'll just call it defs.svg. We're going to add that attribute because now it's not in an HTML5 document anymore. You need to define its namespace a little bit. And now when we go to do a use, we can just reference the path to that file and then the thing. So it doesn't have to be defined on that page. You can give it a full kind of URI to where that document is. And then you get caching, which is great, except in IE, which is a bummer. And hopefully they'll fix that. But this is even IE 11, so you kind of need to address it in some way. Thankfully, there's a really clever little script that handles this, that's just like, if it works, it leaves it alone. And if it doesn't work, it just makes an AJAX request for that file, drops it in the document, and then it works fine. So it's actually a really tiny little script that makes this work called SVG for everybody. One more little improvement that we can do to this is instead of using those G tags, those groups of the icons, we can use the symbol tag instead. It's kind of what it was built for, which is kind of neat. So this is what it was like before. We had the group tag, and then when we used it, what we needed to do is have a view box on there, which I know we don't have time to get into all that, but it's kind of like the aspect ratio space that the SVG was designed to be drawn in. And then for accessibility reasons, there's accessibility tags that you can put in there like title and description. I'm just showing description here. I should probably be using title actually, but that's like stuff that you're responsible for, that you have to get right for this thing to work. So I think we can fix that up a little bit. So rather than using the defs tag at all, we'll use the symbol tag instead of the G. We'll put a view box right on that symbol and then put the accessibility tags inside that symbol as well. Now when we go to use it, we can do that. We can omit the viewport, and we can and the accessibility information kind of comes along for the ride. So it's just easier to type, easier to use, and harder to screw up. So it's kind of a good system, I think. Here's a system called Iconic that I think I made a little movie out of it, didn't I? Is that going to play? Sure. That is a kind of a modern icon system built on this system that's worth checking out, kind of. I don't think that's playing very well. That's okay. All right, so let's going to use some inline SVG. And now that we're using inline SVG, and here I think I'm using the symbol system, and I have a use tag that's pulling in this blender icon that's got going on here. We can do cool things to it. I can style it now with CSS. I can make it bigger just by changing its width and height, and it stays sharp and stays nice. I can target individual elements in there. Let's say the paths and shapes and stuff had IDs and classes on them that we're used to styling with CSS already. I can change the fill color just right through the CSS that's being applied to the page, just like I would change anything else on the page. I can apply filters to it, and I grayscaled it out there. I applied some CSS transforms and opened the lid. I'm using a media query here now that there's less space available, I hid some of the styling, the little button and stuff, and just kind of got rid of it. I can, take that to more extremes, hide even more stuff as the page gets smaller. It's the kind of thing going on in this demo, right? We have one icon here that gets changes its shape based on the amount of screen available, responsive icons. It's pretty rad, right? Try to do that with an icon font. Yeah. All this stuff is possible because inline SVG is cool, and it just allows for that. You still get some benefits of using just image source equals whatever .svg. You still get the sharpness, the scalability and stuff, and it's great for some circumstances, but the inline SVG is where kind of a lot of the cool stuff of SVG shines. I thought we might put these to battle a little bit, because I think a lot of people are still even kind of excited about icon fonts, and I'm like, yeah, but you should do this instead, because it's better. There's anti-aliasing problems with using fonts. It applies anti-aliasing such that it's a font that you're supposed to read, but sometimes there can be some fuzz involved. You don't have that problem with SVG. You have all the same CSS control that you would have using an icon font with SVG. You can change colors and all that stuff, but actually there's more you can do with SVG, because you can change strokes and stuff, some things that you can't do with CSS. The positioning of SVG I find to be a lot better. The positioning of an icon font is subject to line height and letter spacing and the design of the glyph and kerning information. And so it's really hard to line an icon perfectly up to the upper edge of something or the right edge. I just find it a lot easier in SVG. You can just tell it where to go, and it just kind of goes there. There's all kinds of ways that icon fonts can fail. SVGs either works or it doesn't. The semantic nature of icon fonts, in order to really do it right and appropriately, you had to kind of use a span with the right area attributes and then provide fallback text in there that you hide and then use pseudo elements to inject it and stuff. I think the semantics of SVG just says, I'm an image here. It's just stronger. It's just, instead of basically no semantics that come along with an icon font. Accessibility we covered is better, and I think that the build tools and the ease of use and the practicality of just designing your own icons and just injecting them into your own system is just better. They're just better. The one negative one for SVG that icon fonts wins on is that the @font face thing in CSS works way back. It works even in IE6, right? So if you really need an icon system and you really need super old browser support, you can be better served with that. And I think GitHub is still using the icon fonts, and I suspect that's why, because they support a little older stuff. If you are using icon fonts, I encourage you to read this Filament Group article that explains all the difficulties of it and how, all the things that you can screw up with icon fonts, and it kind of knocks them down one by one. So if you're going to use it, read this Bulletproof Accessible Icon Fonts article. I think it's really good. Again, this is not totally theoretical. This is me, and as I was converting all of the icons on CodePen over to SVG, I was so happy with how sharp they looked and how consistently they were positioned across browsers, even in IE. And then the ones in the footer I hadn't done yet, and I was like, oh man, they look so much better than those fuzzy garbage icon ones in the footer. So I was just taking these screenshots as I was doing it. We talked about accessibility a little bit. There is a good article called Tips for Creating Accessible SVG by Leonie Watson, who gives a good checklist of things that you can follow. And just due to our limited time, we probably won't go down the whole list, but know that in these slides, which I'll happy to give to any of you, I'm surely this conference has some way to distribute slides. Otherwise, bug me on Twitter and I'll give them to you directly. This is kind of like what it looks like, having the proper ARIA attributes and title and description tags and using text in there when appropriate and putting links in there as necessary and stuff. Text in SVG is actually really interesting. The text is always sized relative to the SVG kind of viewport itself. So if you do interesting typographic things in SVG, as you scale that SVG, they're like maintained, which would be a difficult thing to do in HTML. Here's kind of a demo of that. This is just regular, selectable, SEO-friendly text that's using @font face, because your SVG has access to whatever fonts that your document has access to. And then as I scale this thing up and down, you can see that the integrity of that like typographic design stays there, which is kind of a neat thing. But more on this icon font thing, you probably want a build tool to help you out with it. You probably are working as a designer with just a folder of SVG files, just like arrow.svg and home.svg and all that stuff. We'll get into that in a sec. There is a tool called Icomoon that does a great job of just, I want this one, this one, this one, this one. Give me the SVG sprite output, and you just click a button and you have it. And that's great. And what's cool about this is it's not just these icons that you have access to. If you've designed them, you can just upload them there. In fact, you don't have to use any of these icons. You can have your own whole set, drag and drop them on here, click the SVG output, and you have it. It's a really easy to use thing, but it's a build tool. It's a legit build tool, and the output is, all of the SVGs individually as well as the sprited version, and it gives you like, did you forget how to do this? Don't worry, here's an example HTML file you can copy and paste from. If you want it to build into your actual nerdy, grunty build step or gulp or whatever, there's a grunt and gulp plugin for both of this. Takes your folder full of SVG files and processes them all into a nice SVG sprite that's ready to use. So you can just have, for example, grunt be watching your folder full of SVGs for changes. If there is a change, it just processes and makes that new sprite that's ready to go. Remember, that's essentially that thing that's just full of symbols ready to use. And then you just reference that file with the use tag with the right ID on it, and you're good to go. You're drawing an icon on your site. It's this idea of processing this folder full of SVGs into a sprite. So the ease of use is totally better than icon fonts, I think. Grumpicon is a pretty cool tool for it as well. It has a bit of a different approach, though. Perhaps you've heard of Grunticon or Grumpicon. It takes your folder full of SVGs, but the output that it gives you is a CSS file of all of those icons as like data URIs right in there. So when you're applying an icon with Grumpicon, you give a certain element a class name, and then the background image of it is that SVG. That's cool and useful, but remember, it doesn't have quite all the cool features this inline SVG has, like, for example, changing the colors on individual shapes and making them responsive and all that stuff. Still a great tool. Maybe you don't need those features anyway, so go for it, but it's just a little bit different in its approach that you should know about. Optimizing SVG is something you should think about. We often think about it with raster graphics, and that use JPEG Mini or these tools that are like, we know that Photoshop, even when you're outputting for web, doesn't give you the best optimized quality, so you have to run it through Image Optim or whatever. That you can think of SVG in that same way. Illustrator isn't giving you the most optimized possible SVG file. There's a great tool called SVGO that you can run it through that removes a lot of that junk, optimizes it, but still looks exactly as you had it before. So know about that. This is a little video to be like, don't fear the command line. It's easy, but we have limited time, so let's not watch it. Cool. This is about the sizing of SVG. I think we're gonna skip through it, but it just has to. I'm kind of showing you about that the view box attribute kind of defines the aspect ratio of how a SVG is going to be sized and look like, and they're different. The viewport of an SVG is the size that you tell an SVG to, but with literally width and height attributes, either on it or defined in the CSS itself. And if those two things match, that's great, right? These ones always take a minute to load. But if there's a mismatch, say that you've told the SVG to be wider than its view box is, it will often just center itself in there. And you can control that through an attribute called preserve aspect ratio. But just know that if you're having weird times with your icons or whatever, like why is it down here and not up here, there might be a mismatch in its view box and its viewport. Cool. And that's the preserve aspect ratio bit. Fallbacks, I could tell some of you have to support IE8. I felt like there was chuckles at that point. There's ways to handle this, and remember that not all the ways that you use graphics on the web need a fallback. For example, if you have some buttons and you apply a cool little icon to that button, there's no need really for a fallback, and that's the only way you're going to use it. That's still a button that says download from GitHub on it. There's no, you don't actually have to make that work any deeper than that. So just remember that that applies in CSS too. We'll get to that. I think if you're using image with source, the best bet is picture fill, which people often think of responsive images with picture fill, but it handles different sources as well, and it handles the double download issue. And I know we're not talking about any of that, but this is a great way to handle using SVG and HTML with a fallback without the double download situation. If you're using SVG and CSS, you don't need any help at all. Just a little trick here that combines multiple backgrounds with the old syntax of linear gradients, and those two things combined magically allow for this to work. So you declare a fallback above that, and then this particular syntax, and that works for CSS. But remember, in CSS, the reason that this image is in CSS probably means that it's decorative, and that it may not be totally vital that you have a fallback at all, so think about that. In the inline SVG thing, the fallback is the script again, this SVG for everybody that we already looked at. It has some cool stuff built into it so that you can declare a fallback PNG that's ready for that. So in supporting browsers, again, it just does nothing. It fixes the IE problem, but then in old IE, it also swaps in an image in place of what was there with the PNG version. So it's actually a pretty nice, very small script for dealing with fallbacks for inline SVG, which is cool. So it looks like we're about out of time, so we're going to skip some of the fun stuff, which is just animating, but all it was just a bunch of videos that, you can watch online and stuff anyway. So anyway, thanks for listening to my SVG talk. If you want to talk about SVG, come find me and stuff, and we'll talk. I love talking about SVG. Thanks, everybody.